It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and our next guest on the show today is Lew Rockwell. He's the chairman of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. You can find their website at Mises.org. And he also runs the website LewRockwell.com, which includes two great blogs, LewRockwell.com/blog and LewRockwell.com/political theater, for his coverage of especially the 2012 presidential race. Welcome to the show, Lew. How are you doing?
Scott, great to be with you.
So Ron Paul's running for president. What's that got to do with peace on earth?
Well, let me just mention, since I'm going to be discussing politics, I'm giving you my own views, and I'm certainly not speaking for the Mises Institute, which is a non-political organization. But Ron Paul is a real peace candidate. Certainly Gene McCarthy, I think, came closest before Ron to being a real peace candidate. I don't really think George McGovern was a real peace candidate, although he did talk about peace. But Ron Paul is the real deal. I mean, he all his adult life, he's been a man of peace, both personally and ideologically, and he understands, like Murray Rothbard did, that the key issue is foreign policy and war. Of course, the Fed is extremely important, and sometimes I wonder whether they founded the Fed to fight World War I, or did they fight World War I to found the Fed? I mean, I don't know the chicken and the egg point, but so, of course, a million important issues about all the horrendous regulatory shackles on the free market, all the horrendous taxes. Always remember, tax is shorthand for wealth destruction. So when they talk about taxes, that's what they're talking about. So, the welfare state, corporate welfare, bailing out the banks, I mean, all the horrendous stuff they're doing, but the absolute worst thing they do is war. Not only because, of course, first and foremost, all the innocent people murdered, and just because somebody's in another country and the U.S. doesn't like them doesn't make them, of course, a guilty person. So there's the blood and the destruction, but then there's also the increase in state power that comes about from war. As Ludwig von Mises said, even the winning country loses because its own government is vastly strengthened. And so therefore the people and the economy, the society lose as the predatory state grows bigger and bigger as it feasts on blood. That's what happens in war. So Ron Paul, he's the real deal. He's an actual man of peace personally and a peace candidate. His religion is of peace. I mean, he really, there's been, I don't think, is there ever been anybody else like that running for president? Again, Gene McCarthy came the closest, and I think Gene McCarthy was a great guy. But he was no Ron Paul. Ron Paul is sounding the clarion call, exactly what we need to hear about how vicious these wars are, how destructive they are to our own liberties. Again, I think this is always secondary. The people we're murdering is the main point. But he's right. We can't have a free country while we have an empire. This is what some of the 18th century Americans said too. Because of course an imperial government that feels perfectly free to bomb and murder people overseas is hardly going to hesitate to run your house, your school, your family, your business, your church, whatever else. So by emphasizing the peace issue, Ron Paul shows what is in a very courageous thing. What is the important issue? But look what he's done. I mean, when he first started talking about this stuff, he was really a lone voice outside of a few libertarians. Today, he's brought along vast numbers of young people, vast numbers of actual Republicans, if you can believe it, to understand that war is not, what was that slogan from the 60s? War is not healthy for children and other growing things, or whatever. So, I mean, it's bad in every sense, and he has shown what one person can do. I mean, he has vastly spread the message of peace, the urgent moral message that we have to have peace. If we want civilization, Mises, of course, made the same point, Rothbard, many other great men. If we want civilization, if we want prosperity, if we want freedom, we have to have peace, because war is the enemy of everything decent and everything good.
Indeed. Well, one thing that I thought was actually really interesting was in Ron Paul's book, A Foreign Policy of Freedom, which is a collection of speeches from, I believe it's the late 70s through, a couple of years ago.
Yes. Yeah, wonderful collection.
And now it's been a little while since I read it, but I think I remember that in some of those earlier speeches in the 70s and maybe in the early 80s, he starts off a little bit right-wing on a little hawkish on China and Russia, and seemed, I think, skeptical of like the Nixonian opening with China and that kind of thing. But by 82 or 83 or something, you can tell he's completely over even believing in the Cold War, that he really is like a completely plumbline antiwar.com style libertarian by the very early 80s.
No, and of course the Cold War was all a trick. And it was started by the U.S., Harry S. Truman and his cohorts, and it was all a trick. I mean, the Russians, the Soviets, were responsible, I guess, for the worst government ever in the history of the world, the Soviet Union. But because it was always an economic basket case, they never had the wherewithal to have wars. I mean, they were able to fight World War II because of the vast amount of aid that the U.S. gave them. But they were afraid of war. Because they knew that war was the one thing that could overthrow them. So they were not anywhere near as belligerent as the U.S. And of course, we can see since the end of the Cold War who actually was the belligerent. I mean, who actually, since the end of the Cold War, has been trying to rule the entire world and has started war after war after war. It's of course the U.S.
Right, that's what Chalmers Johnson says, is that he was a spear carrier for empire up until the end of the Cold War, and then when NATO didn't disband, he went, well, wait a minute. Like Pat Buchanan, hey, the promise was a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores for the duration of the emergency only. Now what is this? And Chalmers Johnson said that then he went back and he restudied the history of the Cold War that he had supported all those decades, in fact, teaching as a professor at USC. And he said, I was wrong. That's it. I was wrong. It was all a trick.
Well, it was a trick, and the Soviets didn't even want to take over Eastern Europe. It wasn't until the U.S. started moving in belligerently against them that they then tragically and horribly staged communist coups in Western Europe, and of course taking those countries behind the Iron Curtain. But still, I mean, Stalin withdrew from Austria, he withdrew from occupied Iran, and he offered to withdraw from occupied Germany in the early 1950s. Not because Stalin was a good guy, by the way. He was one of the great monsters in the history of the human race. But he was afraid of war, and he did not want war. And especially after what Russia went through in World War II, when they suffered so many casualties and such economic destruction, which they could hardly afford. So he offered to get out of East Germany and allow the reunification of Germany, if the U.S. would agree that Germany would be neutral and would not be a member of NATO. The U.S. refused. So the fact that the East German people had to spend another 30 years under the boot of communism, that's Eisenhower and Truman and the U.S. Pentagon and CIA and so forth that refused the hand of peace at the great cost to the people of East Germany. So the U.S. has always been the belligerent power, and in fact, as Hans Hoppe points out, the most belligerent powers have always been at least somewhat classically liberal in their economies, because that gives them the economic wherewithal to do mischief with. Mm-hmm. The Soviets, because they were barely surviving, and of course didn't even trust their own soldiers with bullets, although I'm reminded that American soldiers are not trusted with bullets in this country either. But they just couldn't get it together. I'm sure they would have loved to rule the world. They would have loved to have their boot on the throat of every human being on earth. They couldn't do it economically, and therefore they were not anywhere near as belligerent as the U.S. The U.S. has been, certainly ever since World War II, the belligerent power on the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm. Well, and this is kind of the paradox of the free society. It seems like, you start out free, you get rich and powerful enough, along comes the greed and the corruption. To match that, as George Lucas wrote in the prologue to Star Wars, and then comes the empire and destruction. The only thing standing between this and that, I guess, is ideas. And the willingness of somebody, the willingness of a society to have a Congress full of Ron Pauls who just won't abuse the power that they have.
Well, since there's only been one in more than 200 years, I'm not waiting for a Congress full myself.
Yeah, which I guess means more empire until collapse. The road we're headed down. All right, well, hold it right there, everybody. It's Lew Rockwell from LewRockwell.com and the Mises Institute. We'll be right back after this.